Some of the most unforgettable monsters in film history were just a man sweating inside a rubber suit, lit by a single bulb on a borrowed soundstage. Back when Saturday afternoons belonged to the drive-in and the late-night creature feature, a whole underground of filmmakers was cranking out horror for the price of a used car. Mexican wrestlers brawling vampire women, Japanese studios flattening cardboard Tokyo, and homegrown showmen splattering the screen with effects that cost pennies. The studios looked down on all of it. The fans never did, and decades later, it is the cheap stuff people still quote and stay up too late watching. The strange secret was that having no money forced these movies to be weirder and bolder than the polished competition. So we begin at the very bottom, with a picture so broken it had to be assembled out of two different films that never should have met. The worst movie the show had ever aired. That was the verdict from Paul Chaplin, one of the writers on Mystery Science Theater 3000. And he wasn't reaching for an easy laugh. He had seen the competition. To understand how a film earns a title like that, it helps to know it was really two films, stitched together out of accident and desperation. It began in Wisconsin in 1961, when a young filmmaker named Bill Rebane started a no-budget science fiction quickie he called Terror at Half Day, about a radioactive astronaut turned monster. He cast a 7'6" vaudeville giant, Henry Height, in the role, shot what he could afford, then ran out of money and walked away. The footage sat unfinished for years. Then, Herschell Gordon Lewis, a Florida showman who would soon invent something far more notorious, bought the orphaned reels for almost nothing. Instead of finishing Rebane's story, he hired a new cast, filmed fresh scenes around the old ones, and recorded a wandering voiceover himself to cover the gaps. He released the result on the bottom half of a double bill, beneath one of his own backwoods pictures. Those scenes are the entire show. Characters vanish from the story partway through and are quietly replaced by brothers nobody bothers to explain. In one scene, an actor supplies the ringing of a telephone with his own mouth, and the monster's big climactic attack, the moment the whole picture has been crawling toward, happens completely off camera, narrated to you in that rambling voiceover while you stare at not very much at all. 2 weeks. That was the entire shooting schedule for a film that has since earned a permanent place on the lists of the worst movies ever made. A Connecticut dinner theater actor named Del Tenney directed it for $50,000, splitting the cost with a drive-in magnate, and shot the whole thing around Stamford with whatever local talent he could round up. The monsters were the whole show, for better and worse. Designed by Robert Verberkmos, the radioactive sea creatures had mouths crammed with pale, lumpy shapes that most viewers read instantly as hot dogs. The suits were built so cheaply that one of them shrank during production and ended up on the shoulders of a 16-year-old local boy. Tenney turned all of that into the pitch. He billed the picture as the first horror monster musical, hired a New Jersey band to play rock numbers between the killings, and lifted a gimmick from William Castle, making audiences sign a fright release before they were let inside. The distribution deal came out of an even stranger piece of showmanship. Tenney reportedly carried one of the rubber sea zombie suits into his pitch meeting at 20th Century Fox, and the costume played far better in person than it ever did on screen. As the story goes, a studio executive came away genuinely shaken after meeting the creature unexpectedly in the men's room. Fox took the picture. 2 decades on, it turned up in a book on the 50 worst films of all time and became a steady target for late-night mockery, and it gathered admirers anyway, the most famous of them a young horror novelist named Stephen King. The science never holds up for a second. A botanist injects a chimpanzee with a serum meant only to make it grow, and grow it does. Except it also changes species on the way, arriving on the other side as a full-sized gorilla. No explanation is offered because none is possible. That single piece of biological nonsense sits at the dead center of an Eastman color riff on King Kong, built in London by the producer Herman Cohen for $500,000, with the British studio Anglo Amalgamated and American International each putting up half. Cohen knew this kind of lurid horror well, having already made I Was a Teenage Werewolf and Horrors of the Black Museum, and he understood the pull of a familiar name. He paid RKO $25,000 purely for the right to use a title that rhymed with Kong, after first toying with calling the thing I Was a Teenage Gorilla. What the money could not buy was a convincing monster. The miniature work is visibly cheap, and the great ape rampaging through London is plainly a man in a suit. The film stays watchable on the strength of Michael Gough, who plays the mad botanist Dr. Charles Decker with enormous scenery-chewing relish, surrounded by carnivorous plants and filming on after-hours permits in the real streets of the city. That mix of high ham and low budget made it a fixture for Monster magazine readers who studied its stills for years. The oddest part of its legacy arrived on the page. The comic artist Steve Ditko took that same gorilla and made him the lead of a Charlton comic that ran for years, long outliving the cheap little picture that gave it a name. In 1960, Italian cinemas got a moody little melodrama titled Sedok l'erede di Satana, which translates to something like Sedok, the heir of Satan. By the time it reached American screens 3 years later, it carried a snappier name. That name is a small work of fiction in itself, since the film has no atomic age and no vampire anywhere in it. The story it actually tells is lifted almost beat for beat from Georges Franju's elegant 1959 Chiller Eyes Without a Face. A scientist restores the ruined face of a nightclub dancer, then learns the cure only lasts if he keeps finding fresh victims to harvest. Director Anton Giulio Mahano padded the idea out with clumsy transformation scenes, turning his mild-mannered Professor Levin into a lumpy, vaguely reptilian brute for reasons the script never tries to justify. The English dub, recorded for the 1963 American release, is rough enough that even devoted fans of Italian genre cinema tend to wince. The picture's real claim to fame is how badly it has been treated ever since. The original ran a patient 105 minutes. The American cut hacked it down to 87, and the cheapest home video editions shaved it as low as 69. That leaves you with a film you can watch in 3 wildly different lengths and grow bored by in 3 different ways, which is exactly how it earned its long residence in the dollar bin. Picture a diver in a skull mask gliding through the green canals of Venice at night, hauling his latest victim down into a flooded catacomb. I love that image, and I love that the rest of the movie around it is mostly a sightseeing tour. This is one of only 2 films the Italian writer-director Dino Tavella ever made, and it's the one where he decided the way to stretch a horror picture to feature length was to point the camera at every postcard view in the city. The plot, what there is of it, follows a reporter shepherding a busload of college students through Venice while a hooded killer picks off tourists along the canals. In between the scares, you get travelogue footage, a nightclub scene, and an Italian Elvis impersonator who rises up out of a coffin to perform a number. None of it makes much sense, and honestly, that's part of the charm. The killer wears a monk's robe and keeps his victims posed behind glass like a museum exhibit, all of it scored to loose, improvised jazz that sounds like it wandered in from a different film entirely. Tavella died only a few years later, at 49, which makes this strange little movie his accidental monument. And if you've got a taste for the kind of European weirdness where the scenery is gorgeous and the logic is optional, you're in luck, because we're staying on the continent for the next one, and it has a werewolf, a girls' school, and a theme song you will not believe got written. In the early 1960s, an Italian and Austrian crew shot a modest black and white horror picture under the plain title Lycanthropus. The director, Paolo Hirsch, was credited as Richard Benson because the Italian producers had decided American-sounding names sold better abroad. The script came from Ernesto Gastaldi, then near the start of a career that would make him one of Italy's most important horror writers. The film itself is a quiet, talky murder mystery set at a girls' reformatory, closer to a German crime thriller than to a monster movie. A student, played by Barbara Lass, investigates a string of killings, while a man in werewolf makeup lurks at the edges of the story. His transformation's achieved with simple dissolves shot in reverse. There is very little blood and a great deal of conversation. Anyone lured in by that lurid English title was, frankly, being conned, and the con was glorious. The snaggle-toothed werewolf on the posters and in the magazine stills promised carnage the actual film politely declines to provide. The most lasting piece of the whole enterprise has nothing to do with the werewolf at all. For the 1963 American release, the distributor commissioned a goofy theme song titled The Ghoul in School, a bouncy little number played over the opening credits and pressed as an actual single you could buy. A werewolf movie with almost no werewolf in it, remembered today mostly for a novelty record. Here is something genuinely strange to wrap your head around. The hero of this movie was a real man who, by his own rule, never once showed his face in public. El Santo, the silver-masked legend of Mexican wrestling, kept that hood on in the ring, in interviews, and reportedly almost everywhere else for decades. So when he started headlining horror films, the mask came with him, and audiences simply accepted a masked wrestler as their leading man. This one is widely considered the best of the dozens of Santo pictures, which is a low bar that it clears with room to spare. The setup is pure Saturday matinee nonsense. A coven of vampire women plans to claim a professor's grown daughter for their unholy queen, so naturally, the professor calls in a masked wrestler to sort it out. Every so often, the story grinds to a complete halt, so Santo can wrestle a full match in the ring because the producers knew exactly what the kids had paid to see. A Florida distributor named K. Gordon Murray, who built a small empire dubbing Mexican films for American children's matinees, bought it, renamed Santo as Samson to dodge a trademark snag, and shipped it off to weekend TV. For a lot of us, this is where the rabbit hole begins. It later became one of the most beloved episodes of Mystery Science Theater 3000, and once you have seen a silver-masked grappler body slam the undead, there is simply no going back. If you ever wondered how a person ends up with a shelf full of Mexican wrestling monster movies, this is usually the first one. $3,000, 2 days of work. That is what the veteran actor John Carradine cost this production, and it was real money against a total budget of $37,000. The man writing the checks was Ted V. Michaels, a mustachioed showman who lived in a genuine Los Angeles castle and made films exactly this cheap on purpose. I have a real soft spot for this brand of shameless thrift, and this one is close to a perfect specimen of late 60s no-budget science fiction. Carradine stands in a basement dressed up as a laboratory and recites pages of invented techno-jargon, while solar-powered synthetic men shuffle off to attack people. The cult actress Tura Satana turns up as a glamorous foreign spy. Wendell Corey, visibly unwell, gives what would be his final screen performance and died not long after filming wrapped. The opening credits, for reasons no one has ever explained, play over a pair of wind-up toy robots clattering into each other, an image that never returns and connects to nothing else in the picture. It would be a forgotten title today if not for one odd twist of pop culture. The punk band The Misfits borrowed its name for one of the best-known songs they ever recorded. That single scrap of secondhand fame did more for the movie's legend than the movie itself ever managed, and honestly, I think it came out ahead on the deal. There is a moment in this movie when the scares stop being fake. In the middle of a lurid, brightly colored monster picture, the film cuts away to genuine surgical footage, real hands working inside a real chest, spliced in to shock a paying audience. Nothing else on this entire list does anything quite like it, and once you know it is there, the movie becomes very hard to shake. The man responsible was René Cardona, a giant of Mexican exploitation cinema, who co-wrote this one with his son and built it as a glossy color remake of his own 1962 wrestling horror picture, Doctor of Doom. The original Spanish title translates to something like The Horrible Man-Beast, and the story earns it. A desperate surgeon, frantic to save his dying son, transplants the heart of a gorilla into the boy, and the operation works far too well. The young man is slowly overtaken by the animal inside him, turning into a snarling, pajama-clad creature who breaks loose and goes on a violent rampage through the city. It is the kind of premise that could only come from a filmmaker completely unbothered by science, taste, or restraint, and Cardona attacks it with total straight-faced commitment. He even shot extra footage for different markets, quietly adjusting just how far the picture would go depending on where it was due to play. What pushed it from cheerful nonsense into genuine notoriety was the American release. The distributor wanted something harder for late-night crowds, so he spliced in those clips of real operating room footage along with a string of crude shock effects, betting that audiences would gasp first and ask questions later. The bet paid off, perhaps too well. When the film reached Britain, censors banned it outright during the video nasty panic of the 1980s, and for years, it carried a reputation as one of the most disreputable titles you could track down. Time has been kinder since. Today, fans treasure it as Cardona's most shameless creation, a wild, tasteless collision of masked wrestling, mad science, and real medicine crammed into a single, disreputable package. Whether anyone ever needed to drop a true surgery into a man in an ape suit movie is a question the film never pauses to ask. And maybe that refusal to flinch is the most honest thing about it. The production could not afford the bottom half of the gorilla costume. That single detail explains almost everything that follows. With no legs to show, the giant ape is filmed only from the chest up, forever lurking behind rocks and bushes, never once allowed to take a full step on camera. I find this kind of thing weirdly inspiring. David L. Hewitt wrote it, produced it, directed it, and then climbed into the top half of the suit himself, which is the sort of total commitment you have to respect even when the results are catastrophic. The African jungle is a couple of well-worn California canyons dressed up with stock footage. The climactic battle between the ape and a dinosaur is fought with what is very plainly a plastic toy puppet, held just out of frame and wobbled around with feeling. Anthony Isley plays a failing circus owner who hopes that capturing this beast will save his struggling business, and a couple of other faded names drift through to collect a paycheck. Almost nothing about it works. Lines are fluffed and never reshot. Stock music swells up and swallows the dialogue whole. Painted backdrops stand in for mountains. And yet there is a strange purity to a film this committed to being this cheap. Critics who have waded through the absolute worst that cinema has to offer still float it as a contender for the single worst movie ever made, which depending on your tastes is either a damning verdict or a glowing recommendation. This is a man-hunting man thriller that borrows its entire plot without credit from Richard Connell's famous short story, The Most Dangerous Game. A crazed big-game hunter traps 4 young castaways on his island and turns them loose as quarry, keeping his earlier victims preserved in glass cases as trophies. The film was directed by Ralph Brooke, the only feature he ever made, and shot in 1959 on a tiny Hollywood stage before sitting unreleased for 2 full years. The cheapness is the kind people remember. The island jungle is a cramped soundstage, and the hunter's cave is lined with cardboard walls so obviously flimsy that critics still point to them as some of the most unconvincing sets ever committed to film. One of the trapped teenagers is played by a baby-faced Robert Reed, a couple of years before he settled into living rooms forever as the father on The Brady Bunch, which gives the whole thing a strange double life for anyone who grew up on that show. Brooke died only 2 years after the film finally limped into theaters, so it was never going to make him famous. Its real foothold in memory came decades later, when Mystery Science Theater 3000 used it to introduce one of the show's most enduring villains, Pearl Forrester. A forgotten little film from 1959 became, of all things, the launch pad for a beloved recurring character. For decades, this was a film that monster fans knew everything about, and yet had never actually seen. It existed in their imaginations as a handful of haunting photographs in famous monsters of filmland, a face like a melted marshmallow staring out from the page while the film itself sat completely out of reach. You could read about it for years and never once watch a frame. The picture behind those stills was a quick black and white feature shot for 20th Century Fox in just 7 days around Malibu and Santa Monica. It was the directing debut of Gene Nelson, a former song and dance man, and it starred the dependable John Ager as a scientist whose own nerve gas experiment warps him into a swollen blackened killer with a lethal touch. There are small pleasures hiding in it, like a doomed gas station attendant played by the Three Stooges' Joe Besser, and a brief early appearance by Butch Patrick, who would grow up to play Eddie on the Munsters. The reason it vanished was purely a matter of paperwork. Fox's television rights lapsed in the early 1980s, and the print slipped into a legal gray zone where nobody could legally show it. The film might have disappeared for good, except that John Ager himself held onto a copy and quietly handed a videotape dub to a film historian not long before he died in 2002. A movie famous for being unseeable survived because its leading man refused to let it go. He has pincers for hands, a long darting tongue, and a misshapen skull that throbs like it might burst. This is one of the strangest monsters of the entire decade, and he comes attached to one of the strangest stories. The creature was once a 17th century nobleman, a sorcerer condemned and burned by the Inquisition, who swears revenge on the descendants of his judges and gets his chance 300 years later when a comet carries his spirit back to Earth. The producer Abel Salazar liked the role enough to play it himself at the ABSA studios in Mexico City under the direction of the prolific Chano Urueta. The budget shows in the loveliest ways. The comet streaking through space is a piece of cardboard sliding across a sheet of glass. The grand exteriors are painted backdrops, and the resurrected monster prowls through it all, draining the minds of his victims, sometimes dipping into a goblet for a snack between killings. The Florida showman K. Gordon Murray dubbed it into English and fed it to American late-night television, where a generation of sleepless kids met that rubbery, flicking tongue. Between the comet, the goblet, and a policeman who turns up wielding a flamethrower, this is the film many devotees crown the holy grail of Mexican horror. The strangest tribute of all, though, came from the rock musician Frank Zappa, who was so taken with the creature that he built an entire song around it, a track he recorded with Captain Beefheart that lovingly recalls the rubber-masked, rubber-tongued thing he had once watched flicker across a late-night screen. In the final days of the war, a German submarine slipped out of Europe carrying one of the strangest cargoes ever put on screen. Sealed in its hold was the still-beating immortal heart of Frankenstein's monster, bound for the Japanese mainland. The heart reaches Hiroshima just before the city is destroyed in 1945, and there it waits, until years later it regenerates into a wild, feral boy who keeps on growing until he stands as tall as a building. That premise sounds like a fever dream, and the talent behind it was deadly serious. The film was a partnership between Japan's Toho studio and an American producer, and it had a tangled birth. It grew out of an old, unmade idea by the effects pioneer Willis O'Brien, a pitch once called King Kong vs. Frankenstein that mutated into King Kong vs. Godzilla before this stranger fragment finally broke off to become its own picture. The director was Ishiro Honda, with special effects by Eiji Tsuburaya, the exact pair who had created the original Godzilla a decade earlier, working here alongside Kumi Mizuno and Tadao Takashima. They give the giant boy a worthy opponent in Bragan, a burrowing dog-faced creature from beneath the earth, and stage their brawl across miniature villages with the same craft these men brought to far more respectable projects. Holding the human side together is the American actor Nick Adams, a recent Academy Award nominee who plays his scientist with complete conviction and was, by every account, adored by the Japanese crew. The American distributor trimmed a few minutes, restored Adams' original English dialogue, and quietly passed on an alternate ending Toho had filmed, in which a giant octopus rears up out of nowhere to attack. That footage was never destroyed, so two completely different climaxes survive side by side to this day. Adams thought enough of the whole experience to fly straight back to Japan for another monster picture with the same team, beloved on both sides of the ocean, before his life was cut short in 1968 at just 36. Which of those two endings counts as the real one is a question nobody can fully settle, and somehow that feels exactly right for a film about a heart that refused to stop beating. A muscular man in red tights and a black hood strides through a candlelit castle dungeon, calling himself the Crimson Executioner and admiring his collection of Iron Maidens, racks, and a giant mechanical spider. This is the single most committed bad performance I have ever seen, and I mean that as the highest possible compliment. The man under the hood is Mickey Hargitay, a former Mr. Universe and one-time husband of Jane Mansfield, here playing a reclusive ex-actor who has decided he is the reincarnation of a medieval torturer. When a photo crew wanders into his castle for a shoot, he takes it upon himself to menace them all, flexing and posing and delivering every line as though he is auditioning for the back row of a very large theater. The American posters insisted the whole thing was based on the writings of the Marquis de Sade, which was a complete invention by the marketing department, since the actual script was knocked out by a pair of jobbing Italian writers in no time at all. The director, working under the fake name Max Hunter, shot this at a castle that turns up in dozens of Italian horror and sword and sandal films, and he was efficient about it. He made this picture and a second Gothic chiller almost back-to-back at the same location, with much of the same crew. We are going to meet that second film next, because it ended up sharing more than a castle with this one. It rode into American theaters on the very same double bill. The director said his leading lady was really disgusting to work with. That director was Massimo Pupillo, and the leading lady was Barbara Steele, the dark-eyed queen of Italian Gothic horror, which tells you the shoot was tense and tells you almost nothing about why the film still gets sought out today. The simple answer is Steele herself, who could make a slow, talky ghost story feel genuinely haunted just by standing in a doorway. This was the Gothic chiller the director made right alongside the castle picture from a moment ago, and he was so unhappy with how it turned out that he let the American co-producer take the directing credit instead. The story has Steele as the faithless widow of a dead spiritualist, a medium who, in life, could call up the vengeful souls of long-dead plague carriers and who proves no less dangerous now that he is in the ground. It is moody, candlelit, and patient, the kind of film that lives on atmosphere rather than incident. The detail that always stops people is the camera work. The cinematographer was Carlo Di Palma, who would go on to shoot masterpieces for Antonioni and a long run of Woody Allen films, an astonishing resume for a low-budget movie about reanimated severed hands creeping out of a curiosity cabinet. Whatever Pupillo thought of his star, it was Steele's cold, unsettling presence that sent monster kids hunting for this one, riding as it was on the bottom half of that same double bill. The director's nickname was Mr. Big, earned by a long run of films about things that grow to enormous size. Colossal men, giant spiders, oversized everything. So it is a small surprise that one of his most enjoyable pictures has nothing gigantic in it at all. Burt Y. Gordon set the giants aside here for a haunted island ghost story, and the change of pace suits him. Richard Carlson, of Creature from the Black Lagoon, plays a jazz pianist who stands by and lets his blackmailing former flame fall to her death from a lighthouse, then spends the rest of the film paying for it. She comes back to torment him in pieces. A disembodied head, a talking foot, a drifting bridal apparition that turns up to ruin his upcoming wedding. It is silly and a little eerie at once, and the cheap effects somehow make the haunting feel more dreamlike rather than less. I will admit the main reason I keep a soft spot for this one is a supporting player. A young Joe Turkel turns up as a beatnik ferryman and quietly walks away with every scene he is in. If that name does not ring a bell, the faces will. Years later, Turkel poured Jack Nicholson a drink as the ghostly bartender in The Shining, and built the replicants as Mr. Tyrell in Blade Runner. A bargain basement ghost story, restored in crisp 4K decades on, partly because one of its bit players turned out to be a piece of film history. A black-eyed figure rides out of the dark with a pack of snarling hounds at her heels, and together they fall upon a stagecoach in the night. If that image feels lifted straight from Mario Bava's Italian Gothics, that is because it nearly is, copied almost shot for shot. It is also the moment that announces this as something more ambitious than the average Mexican cheapie, and many fans now consider it the finest Gothic horror the country ever produced. The film came from Abza Studios, the same Mexico City outfit that gave us that comet-born, pincer-handed monster a few entries back, though the mood here could not be more different. A young bride arrives at her aunt's crumbling hacienda just before her 25th birthday and learns she is fated to wake a legendary weeping spirit from local folklore. The screenwriters reshaped that old tale into something closer to a vampire story, with a disfigured captive hidden in the attic and a pack of bone-gnawing dogs prowling the grounds. The candlelit atmosphere is genuinely lovely, the equal of anything the British studios were making in the same years. The same Florida distributor who handled the studio's monster pictures dubbed this one into English and spread it across American television. It builds to a remarkable finale, a miniature mansion collapsing in on itself with surprising skill for the budget. What lingers afterward is the question the folktale always leaves behind, of whether a curse like this is something you inherit or something you become. The film is dreamy enough to let you decide for yourself. First, an eye opens on his shoulder. Then, slowly, a second head pushes its way out beside the first. The transformation at the heart of this film is one of the most memorable in low-budget horror. A man steadily turning into two men, and it is the reason the picture has stayed in the conversation for 60 years. It was made by an American producer working in Tokyo, shot in English in the late 1950s with a mixed American and Japanese cast, which gives it an unusual flavor for its era. Peter Dineley plays an American reporter who falls into the hands of a mad scientist and becomes an unwilling experiment, his body slowly splitting in two until the climax forces the issue at the edge of a smoking volcano. The film took years to reach American theaters, where it finally arrived in 1962, sharing a bill with the US release of a far more respectable French horror film. For all its rough edges, the central effect was genuinely ahead of its time. That image of a single body sprouting a second head turns up again and again in the decades that followed, and filmmakers have pointed back to this cheap oddball co-production as the spark. You can draw a straight line from this volcano-side monster to Sam Raimi's Army of Darkness, which is a remarkable legacy for a movie stitched together on two continents. Fans have described the monster as a 20-story chicken with a jet plane for a head, and once you have heard that, you cannot unsee it. That is genuinely the best way to picture Gilala, the creature at the center of one of the goofiest giant monster movies Japan ever produced, and I mean every word of that affectionately. What makes it stranger is the pedigree. This came from Shochiku, one of Japan's most respected studios, the home of refined art house masters, who apparently took one look at the money Toho was making off rampaging monsters and decided they wanted in. So, the studio of quiet domestic dramas gave the world a giant space chicken that hatches from a glowing spore picked up by a space crew, stomps across the countryside, and is finally brought down by a wonder substance with an unpronounceable name. The model spaceships look borrowed from a 1950s serial. The score leans into breezy lounge jazz, and a genuinely distinguished actor wanders through the lab scenes looking faintly embarrassed to be there. For years, this was a half-forgotten curiosity, the kind of thing that turned up on Saturday morning television and nowhere else. Then, in a twist nobody saw coming, the prestigious Criterion Collection scooped it up and gave it a proper home in 2012, in a box set celebrating exactly this kind of studio detour. A 20-story chicken preserved for posterity by the most respectable name in the business. An archaeologist unwraps an ancient Egyptian relic in his Las Vegas hotel room and is promptly transformed into a snarling beast that roams the strip in broad daylight, while real pedestrians on the sidewalk stop to stare. That single sun-drenched image of a monster loose in a tourist town is the whole appeal, and it is delivered with a complete absence of logic. The lead is played by Anthony Isley, the same actor who fought a half-built gorilla a few entries ago, here cursed and clawing his way around the casinos. The film was directed by a 67-year-old veteran of old westerns, working for a tiny independent outfit that pinched every penny it could. The monster mask was simply recycled from another of the producer's own cheap pictures. John Carradine, ever reliable, drifts in for a brief appearance and his paycheck, then drifts out again. The whole shoot was apparently a mess, and afterward the film vanished so completely that for decades it existed mostly as a rumor, with no proper release until a bare-bones videotape crept out in the 1980s. Then came the happy ending that these lost films sometimes get. The original negative, long thought gone, surfaced at an estate sale in 2019 and was lovingly restored in 4K for a new generation to puzzle over. Isley, for his part, never made peace with the experience. Asked about the production years later, he said flatly that his director had been senile the entire time. On a sunny stretch of California sand, a rubber-suited creature with a fishy face lurches out of the surf and goes after a group of sunbathing teenagers. It looks exactly like the climax of a Scooby-Doo episode, mask and all, and that comparison is even more apt than it sounds because there really is a mystery and an unmasking by the end. The man behind it has a poignant story. John Hall had been a genuine Universal matinee idol in the 1930s and 40s, a swashbuckling leading man and by the mid-60s his star had faded badly. So he made this one almost single-handedly, directing it, producing it, shooting it himself, and starring as a bitter marine biologist who pulls on a fishy mask to terrorize the local kids. It was the only film he ever directed. I find something genuinely touching about an old movie star, far from his glory days, pouring everything into a cheap creature feature about teenagers and surfboards. For all that, it is a genuinely fun watch. The surfing footage is the real thing, shot by an actual surf filmmaker, and the bouncy beach songs were arranged by a 21-year-old Frank Sinatra Jr. The Razzie people, who keep careful track of cinema's lovable disasters, listed among the most enjoyably bad films around. Beach Party, Monster Mask, big band crooning, and a whodunit reveal, all packed into about 70 breezy minutes. You could do a lot worse on a Saturday afternoon. It's just a movie. It's just a movie. That was the soothing little chant the marketing campaign told nervous audiences to repeat to themselves, a gimmick so memorable that a far more famous horror film borrowed it whole years later. It is the cleverest thing about a picture that is otherwise the runt of a notorious litter. This was the third and final film in the so-called Blood trilogy that Herschell Gordon Lewis made with his producing partner David Friedman, the team that had spent the early 60s inventing modern screen shocks on shoestring budgets. The plot is borrowed in spirit from a Roger Corman comedy. A frustrated painter discovers that a particular shade of red is the one thing missing from his canvases and starts using his neighbors as the raw material. It was shot in Florida for around $30,000, with local people filling out most of the cast, and it is drenched in the bright fake blood that became Lewis's trademark. Of the three films in the trilogy, this is the one even devoted fans tend to rank last, but it carries an odd historical weight anyway because it marked the end of an era. After this picture, the long and productive partnership between Lewis and Friedman came apart, and the two men who had built an entire disreputable genre together went their separate ways. The fake blood kept flowing in the films that followed. The friendship behind it did not. Audiences who bought a ticket to this one sometimes found live actors in monster masks come charging up the aisle straight at them. That was an actual selling point, marketed alongside a so-called hypnovision gimmick, which amounted to a spinning spiral meant to put the crowd in a trance. The showmanship was the whole pitch, and it tells you everything about the man behind it. That man was Ray Dennis Steckler, who wrote, directed, produced, and starred in The Thing under the magnificent stage name Cash Flag. He built this carnival fever dream for $38,000 at a Long Beach amusement park and a crumbling 9-story Masonic temple. The original title was so long and so close to Dr. Strangelove that Columbia Pictures threatened to sue, a snag Steckler always claimed he smoothed over by phoning Stanley Kubrick himself. And here is the detail I love most. Hidden in the credits under plain Americanized names are two future Academy Award winners, Vilmos Zsigmond and Laszlo Kovacs, learning their craft on spinning spirals and rubber masks before they became two of the great cinematographers of the 1970s. All of that adds up to one of the strangest entries on any list of cheap classics. It is routinely called the first real monster musical. It beat a famous Beach Party rival to the screen by about a month, and it shows up on nearly every roster of the worst films ever made. A singing zombie carnival picture that somehow earned a place in 3 different histories at once and refuses to be forgotten in any of them. 65 feet of roaring sea monster hauled up off the Irish coast and put on display for paying crowds at a London fun fair. That is the setup, and for once, the budget was there to do it justice. This was an expensive picture by the standards of everything else on this list, reportedly costing around $1.5 million, and every penny is up on the screen in the miniature work, which still ranks among the best giant monster effects of its decade. The man directing was Eugène Laurier, who by this point was something of a reluctant specialist. He had already made The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms and The Giant Behemoth, 2 films about enormous creatures rising from the deep, and this one completed an accidental trilogy he never quite set out to make. The production was backed by the King Brothers and MGM and shot at the MGM British Studios outside London, and Laurier brought serious craftsmen with him. The cinematographer was Freddie Young, who would later earn lasting fame for Lawrence of Arabia, and the effects were handled by a technician who would go on to work on 2001: A Space Odyssey. When showmen capture the creature off the Irish coast and chain it up for the crowds at the Battersea Fun Fair, its far larger mother rises from the sea and comes ashore to find him, and nothing in the city is going to stop her. She tears through London on her way, toppling Big Ben and Tower Bridge and scattering the crowds, a force of pure maternal fury that the showman never once considered when they hauled her child out of the water. That rescue is the heart of the whole thing, and it leads to the detail people remember most. Almost every giant monster movie of this era ends the same way, with the creature destroyed, the army victorious, and order restored. This one does not. Both monsters survive, turn back toward the water, and walk into the sea together. The story goes that Laurier changed the ending for a simple, human reason. His young daughter had wept at the death of the monster in one of his earlier films, and this time, the father decided the creature would be allowed to go home. It is a small, tender choice buried inside a city-stomping monster movie, and it is a big part of why people still love it 60 years on. The plot of this film genuinely does not hold together, and there is a good reason for that. It was directed by at least 6 different people, most of them uncredited, working in fits and starts over many months with no clear plan binding their pieces together. The result is a gorgeous-looking gothic puzzle that never quite resolves into a story. The reason it exists at all is pure thrift. Roger Corman had just finished a lavish Edgar Allan Poe picture and still had the castle set standing, plus 2 days of work owed to him by the great Boris Karloff. So Corman pointed a camera at Karloff for 3 quick days, then spent the following months scrambling to build a movie around that footage. The list of people who pitched in to direct stray scenes is the reason film buffs treasure it. Among them were Francis Ford Coppola, Monty Hellman, Jack Hill, and a young actor named Jack Nicholson, who also takes the leading role opposite his real-life wife at the time. So the film is a mess, and it is also a kind of accidental class photo. Half the people who drifted through this cheap, confusing little production would go on to reshape American movies in the decades that followed. Whether any of them felt it coming, standing around on a borrowed castle set with no real script and a few spare days of Boris Karloff, is impossible to know. That uncertainty is a big part of what makes the footage so fascinating to watch now. A friendly little southern town throws open its arms to welcome a group of visitors with a parade, a banquet, and a warm centennial celebration. The catch is that the townsfolk are long-dead Confederate ghosts, returning once every 100 years to take a gruesome revenge on northern travelers who wander in. That gap between the sunny hospitality and the horror underneath it is what makes this the sharpest film of its kind from the period. The idea was a deliberately twisted inversion of the gentle stage musical Brigadoon, in which a magical village appears for a single day each century. Here, the village appears to lure outsiders to elaborate and grisly fates, which the film stages with a glee that genuinely shocked audiences at the time. The picture was shot in about 15 days in a small Florida town standing in for the fictional Pleasant Valley, using local residents as the ghostly mob, and its bouncy, unforgettable theme song was written and performed by the director himself. The city of Chicago banned it outright in 1964, and it could not play there for 2 more years. For all the controversy, this is the one even the harshest critics tend to respect, the moment its maker's grim sense of humor actually came together into something memorable. Its fingerprints are all over the slasher films that followed, from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre onward, and it would never have existed without the film that started it all, the one that gave its directors their nickname and their entire reputation. That picture is where we are headed next. This is the film that invented an entire genre, more or less by accident, in a Miami motel. Remember that Florida showman from our very first entry, the one who bought a half-finished movie for pocket change and assembled it into the worst picture a comedy show ever aired? This is what he did next, and it changed horror forever. Herschell Gordon Lewis and his producer David Friedman shot it in 4 to 6 days for around $24,000, using the Suez Motel as both their base and their main set. What they made was the first true splatter movie, the first film to put graphic, lingering scares front and center as the entire point. The story is the thinnest possible excuse to get there. An Egyptian caterer named Fuad Ramses gathers grisly ingredients from a string of victims to prepare an ancient feast in honor of the goddess Ishtar. The effects were crude and shockingly explicit for 1963, and the most infamous scene reportedly used a real sheep's tongue carted in from a local butcher. Friedman, always the better showman of the two, handed out novelty bags in the lobby for queasy customers and even took out a fake legal injunction against his own film in Sarasota purely to drum up publicity. None of it was tasteful, and all of it worked. The film had its premiere at a drive-in outside Peoria, Illinois, in the summer of 1963, about as humble a launch as a genre-defining movie has ever had. The numbers tell the rest of the story. Made for around $24,000, it reportedly took in something close to $4 million. A return that turned Lewis into the self-styled godfather of gore overnight and proved there was a hungry audience nobody else was serving. British censors banned it for decades, and it was not past their uncut until 2005. But its real legacy is everything that came after. Pull this single thread, and a huge stretch of modern horror comes loose with it. The slasher boom, the splatter pictures, the whole blood-spattered branch of the genre that runs through the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and far beyond all trace back to this one cheap experiment in a roadside motel. Shot in under a week and mocked for years, it quietly rewired the rules of horror for good, which is exactly why it sits deservedly at our number 1. 28 movies, a few $100,000 between all of them, and somehow more staying power than half the polished prestige pictures of their day. That is the thing these films understood that their critics did not. Having no money pushed them to be stranger, gutsier, and more inventive than the competition, just to earn their spot at the drive-in. The rubber suit honesty of a Bill Rebane, a Ted V. Michaels, or a Herschell Gordon Lewis is exactly why we are still talking about them 60 years later, long after the respectable films of 1964 faded from memory. So next time someone tells you a movie was too cheap to take seriously, point them toward Blood Feast and ask what their favorite scary franchise owes to a man who spent $24,000 and changed the rules. If you had fun on this trip down the drive-in's weirdest aisles, you know what keeps these deep dives coming. So give this video a like and subscribe on your way out. And before you go, settle one thing for me in the comments. Which gloriously cheap, gloriously awful 60s monster did we leave off? The one you would have fought to get onto this list. There are plenty more lurking where these came from.